It was Labor Day weekend in 2019, and the party on South St. Lawrence felt like any other Chicago night until the gunfire erupted and one of the most feared names in the city's street history hit the floor. Whispers spread instantly, with people saying he had been backdoored, set up by someone close. The name was 051 Melly, and the rumors tied his story to a body count that some claimed stretched to 40. To understand how his name carried so much weight in Chicago, you have to step back and look at the city itself, because the streets made him before anything else did. Chicago's South Side has long been one of the most violent urban landscapes in America, with homicide numbers making headlines year after year. In 2016 alone, the city recorded over 700 homicides, and most of those victims and shooters were young black men, barely out of their teens. By 2019, the official homicide count dropped to 436, but that still meant more than one person killed every day, and most of those deaths were connected in some way to the city's street cliques. These cliques were not the big organized gangs that ruled Chicago in earlier decades, but instead smaller and more chaotic groups where leadership barely existed and loyalty often shifted overnight. To understand where cliques like 051 Young Money came from, you have to look at the history of the Black Disciples and Gangster Disciples. Back in the late 1960s, Larry Hoover and David Barksdale helped turn Chicago gangs into something much larger than neighborhood crews, building the Black Gangster Disciples into a nationwide force. After Barksdale's death in the mid-70s, the unity split apart, leaving Black Disciples and Gangster Disciples as rival branches. Through the 80s and 90s, both groups expanded to tens of thousands of members, and they made millions from controlling the crack and heroin trade on the South Side. By the time the mid-2000s came around, federal indictments, housing demolitions, and constant wars had shattered the old structure, leaving behind younger generations who had no interest in following orders from older leaders. Instead of one strong hierarchy, the South Side became a patchwork of cliques, each one tied to a few blocks or a single housing project. These cliques did not answer to anyone above them, and members acted on their own, making every conflict personal and every insult dangerous. A diss on social media could lead to a shooting the same night, and a stare across the street could end in a drive-by before sunrise. In the eyes of these young men, respect and reputation were everything, and retaliation was a rule nobody dared to break. That mindset created a cycle of payback that spiraled out of control by the 2010s, leaving neighborhoods filled with constant fear and tension. Alongside the street violence came drill music, the sound that carried Chicago's neighborhood wars across the globe. Drill was more than just music, it was the soundtrack to the chaos, with rappers calling out rivals by name, mocking the dead, and celebrating their cliques. When Chief Keef dropped I Don't Like in 2012, the world got its first taste of drill, but in Chicago the sound was already a part of daily life. Songs doubled as threats, and videos doubled as propaganda, turning street beefs into entertainment for millions of fans on YouTube. For the young men in cliques like 600, O Block, Jaro City, and 051 Young Money, every track posted online could bring fame or get someone killed because the music blurred the line between art and real violence. The rise of drill also changed how people outside Chicago viewed the city, with outsiders seeing the South Side as a war zone and drill rappers as soldiers. For the kids living there, though, drill was both an outlet and a trap, because the more attention a rapper got, the more likely he was to be targeted by rivals. In this climate, even someone like 051 Melly, who never rapped on tracks himself, became known through the drill culture. His name showed up in songs, in videos, and in online rumors, building his reputation into something larger than life without him needing a microphone. One of the most infamous symbols of how the South Side shaped his youth was the Randolph Towers, a massive 16-story building on South Calumet Avenue, known on the street as the Castle. The Black Disciples turned the tower into a fortress in the early 90s, running a drug market that pulled in tens of thousands of dollars a day. Guards with automatic weapons stood watch at the doors, checking everyone who came in or out. Snipers held positions on the roof looking for enemies with night vision goggles. Inside the building, the BDs operated with military precision, turning a housing project into a stronghold. In 2004, after years of raids and violence, police finally took down the tower, but by then entire generations had already grown up seeing it as normal life. Randolph Towers was the kind of place that shaped futures before a kid even understood the world, because if you grew up there, gang culture surrounded you every day. The lure of money, protection, and belonging pulled kids into the cycle, while fear of being alone or seen as weak pushed them further. For a boy like Yarmel Williams, who the world later knew as 051 Melly, the castle and the streets around it were the classroom that taught him survival. By the time cliques like 051 Young Money started forming around 2008, the ground had already been prepared by decades of wars, broken hierarchies, and neighborhoods built on distrust. Chicago's cliques in the 2010s lived by their own code, and that code was simple. Disrespect could not go unanswered. A killing meant another killing, a diss meant another diss, and reputations grew with everybody that dropped. In this world, the legend of 051 Melly began to grow, because his name became tied to the most feared rule of the streets, the one that said retaliation was not optional, it was mandatory. Before his story ends in that house on South St. Lawrence, you have to understand how the city itself created the kind of man whose name carried weight everywhere he went. Yarmel Williams, who later became known as 051 Melly, was born around 1991 or 1992 on the south side of Chicago. He grew up between Washington Park and Gresham, neighborhoods that had long been shaped by gang politics and constant violence. These areas were not just dangerous streets, but entire environments where kids learned the rules of survival before they even understood childhood. His earliest years lined up with the final years of Randolph Towers, the massive high-rise on South Calumet Avenue that the Black disciples turned into a fortress. The tower had already been known as the Castle, and that name meant something heavy across Chicago. By the early 90s, the Black disciples controlled the building and turned it into a drug market that brought in more than $40,000 daily. Guards with shotguns and assault rifles searched residents in the lobby, while snipers held positions on the rooftop with night vision goggles. That building raised entire generations into a culture where carrying guns and running dope was everyday business. For Yarmel, the environment of Randolph Towers was his first school, and the older figures who stood watch were the first examples of power he saw. The demolition of the tower in 2004 did not erase the culture already planted in the young men who grew up inside. By then, he was already a teenager, and the habits he learned in that place were permanent. You either rolled with the set or risked becoming a victim because neutrality was almost impossible. The Black disciples had turned the tower into their stronghold, and kids like Yarmel carried that influence wherever they went afterward. His family ties only pulled him deeper into that same world. His father, known on the street as Yamur, or sometimes called Yamur King, had a reputation for being connected with the Black disciples. His stepfather, Jerome Golden, who people on the block knew as Frito, was rumored to be serving life for multiple murders and armed robbery. His uncle Kurt Mack, linked with the Mubu set, was killed in 2007 when Yarmel was still very young. Rumors also claimed that he had a connection to NLMB through being a nephew of their founder G Slim, though official records never confirmed that family tie. Either way, family and gang culture were mixed together around him from the very beginning, leaving him surrounded by men whose lives were tied to the streets. This mix of family stories and street survival shaped Yarmel in ways that regular schools could never fix. He attended DuSable High School, located on Chicago's south side near Bronzeville. DuSable was surrounded by territories claimed by different cliques, and the school itself was a battleground where gang affiliation shaped daily life. Yarmel was not a student who played sports or joined organized programs. Instead, he found himself drifting further into the cycle that had already claimed generations of kids before him. At DuSable, the fights, the cliques, and the constant danger prepared him for a life where being tough meant survival. While some kids chased music or sports, Yarmel seemed to embrace the streets as his main path. Chicago drill culture would soon put his name in lyrics, but even before that, he had already been known as someone you did not want to cross. His name carried respect among his peers, partly because of his fearlessness and partly because of his family's reputation. Stories spread quickly about who he might be connected to, and those stories added to his mystique. In neighborhoods like Washington Park and Gresham, reputation traveled faster than facts, and once your name became associated with violence, that shadow never left. The early 2000s in Chicago saw cliques replacing the old organized gang system, and young men like Yarmel were raised in that shift. While older leaders like Larry Hoover were sitting in prison, younger kids created their own rules on the blocks. Yarmel came up during that time, watching the power vacuum form and watching his peers turn into cliques like 600, TYMB, Jarrow City, and 051 Young Money. He would eventually become a key figure inside 051YM, but those early years of moving through Randolph Towers, losing relatives to violence, and attending DuSable gave him the foundation. Chicago had already laid the tracks for his path, and the environment made sure he stayed on it. The childhood of Yarmel Williams was not about innocence or freedom. It was about constant exposure to guns, drugs, and loyalty tests. The people around him either ended up locked up or buried, and each loss only pulled him further into that world. By the time he was a teenager, his future seemed almost set, because the streets had already claimed him before he even had the chance to choose differently. That foundation would carry into the years where his name became feared, where the story of the Gravedigger would begin to grow. But it all started in the hallways of Randolph Towers and the classrooms of DuSable High School. By the time Yarmel Williams reached his teenage years, the streets had already written most of his story, and those first years shaped how he moved when he started transitioning into cliques. He came up as a black disciple kid because of Randolph Towers and his father's influence, but he eventually found himself pulled toward the Mickey Cobras, a smaller set known for their territory around 50th and 51st Streets. The Mickey Cobras had long been tied to the Black P Stones and other sets, but they held their own reputation for being aggressive and willing to cross lines. That pull became stronger for Yarmel when he began hanging with kids who would later form the core of 051 Young Money, because those bonds proved more important than any labels from the past. The switch from a black disciple background to a Mickey Cobra identity was not just a personal decision, it was a reflection of how the streets worked at that time. The old days of organized structure had collapsed, and in their place came loose affiliations based on personal friendships and neighborhood ties. Around 2008, a collection of kids from the South Side came together, mixing Mickey Cobras, black disciples, and gangster disciples into one crew. That crew became known as 051 Young Money, holding territory around 48th to 51st Street and St. Lawrence Avenue. They did not operate like a traditional gang with one leader giving orders. They moved as a clique, each member making choices but united by loyalty to each other. 051 Young Money built a reputation for being relentless in their approach, with people describing them as ruthless and bloodthirsty. The clique had subsets like Drexite Assassins and Young N Reckless, but all carried the same reputation of being willing to slide at any time. Rumors tied them to more than 50 murders across the city, though most of those claims lived only in blogs, forums, and gossip. The police never confirmed those numbers, but the reputation stuck because of how often their name came up after shootings. This was the environment where Yarmel started becoming known not just as another street kid, but as someone who inspired fear whenever his name was spoken. A big part of that rise came from personal connections, and one of the most important was his friendship with 051 Zico. Zico was a Mickey Cobra member who carried influence in the clique, and the two grew close during their high school years. When Zico was killed in a confrontation with THF 46, a rival clique with ties to the Black Disciples, Yarmel reportedly swore revenge. That loss pushed him closer to the core of 051 Young Money, because loyalty to a fallen friend meant more than old neighborhood ties. Stories spread across the South Side that Melly was willing to do whatever it took to honor that loyalty, and his reputation began to grow even louder after that point. Another important bond was with Lil Mark, a rapper tied to 051 Young Money. Lil Mark's music dissed rivals directly, and his presence on tracks gave the clique visibility in the growing drill scene. When he was killed in 2014, speculation quickly pointed toward BD affiliates, and whispers connected Melly to revenge plots almost immediately. Whether those rumors were true or not, they kept his name in constant circulation, because in the streets of Chicago, names become legends through whispers as much as through actual events. That cycle kept feeding into his reputation, making him appear unpredictable and dangerous, even when no charges existed against him. Melly's relationship with other 051 YM members also mattered in shaping how people viewed him. 051 Drilla, one of the more visible members of the set, was known for his presence in music videos and online disses, while Melly operated in a quieter way, more street than camera. People described Melly as cordial when he wanted to be, able to smile and talk casually, but at the same time quick to turn aggressive if provoked. That mix of approachable and unpredictable behavior earned him the description of being cordial but dangerous. On the streets, that reputation made him harder to read and harder to know when he might move. By the early 2010s, rumors started attaching bodies to his name, with online blogs and forums claiming he had been involved in multiple shootings. Some sources claimed he was connected to 15 confirmed kills. Others exaggerated the number up to 40. None of these numbers were backed by official court records, but once the narrative took hold, people repeated it constantly. His reputation grew into something larger than his actual life, because in Chicago's drill era, clout often came from the perception of violence rather than the paperwork of charges. Melly carried guns from a young age, and stories spread of him walking through neighborhoods strapped and unbothered by the risks. That image of fearlessness locked his name in with the idea of being one of the most dangerous young men in the city. The way Melly built his reputation was not through rap tracks or flashy videos, but through being mentioned by others and whispered about after shootings. Drill rappers threw his name into lyrics, whether mocking him or warning others about him. Online channels that documented Chicago street life repeated his story, labeling him a feared hitter who had stacked bodies. Even without official confirmation, the legend spread far beyond Washington Park and Gresham, reaching internet audiences who consumed every rumor about Chicago's gang wars. For people living on the South Side, his presence was real and immediate, but for outsiders, his reputation was a character in a larger story about Chicago's drill scene. In the streets, though, he was just Yarmel, a young man shaped by Randolph Towers, family ties to the Black Disciples, and loyalty to Mickey Cobra friends. His rise inside 051 Young Money showed how cliques operated without needing structure, because loyalty to each other was the only rule. His unpredictable nature kept rivals uneasy. His fearlessness kept his name alive, and his friendships gave him purpose inside the clique. By the time his 20s began, the legend of 051 Melly was already in motion, and the city was beginning to see him as more than just another street figure. His transformation from a Black Disciple kid into the Gravedigger of 051 Young Money was not about one moment, but about years of losses, alliances, and decisions that shaped him into someone whose name still carries weight long after his death. The name 051 Melly really started moving through the streets after the death of his friend Lil Mark in March 2014. Lil Mark, born Mark Campbell, was a young rapper out of 051 Young Money who became known for his drill tracks where he directly dissed rivals. His most infamous track, No Competition, called out multiple sets by name, including STL, Jaro City, and 600. That song was posted online in early 2014 and quickly stirred up attention because Mark was not just rapping general threats, he was putting specific names in the verses. In Chicago's drill culture, calling out names like that was a guaranteed way to bring problems, and for Mark, those problems came quickly. On March 28, 2014, Mark was shot and killed while standing at a bus stop on the South Side. The news hit the city hard because he was one of the first 051 YM members to gain recognition through music, and his murder carried the mark of retaliation for the disrespect in his lyrics. The aftermath of Mark's murder was full of whispers and speculation, and almost instantly people started pointing fingers at 600, a Black Disciple set closely tied to O Block and Only the Family. The tension between 051 YM and 600 had been growing, and Mark's lyrics in No Competition only made things worse. After his death, the pressure for revenge weighed heavy on his friends, and Melly's name started coming up in those conversations. People claimed he was vowing to take revenge for Mark, and soon after that, his reputation began expanding. Even though official charges never came down, people in the city believed Melly had taken part in making someone pay for Mark's death. In the street world, what people believed mattered more than what could be proven in court, and Melly's legend grew larger. In March 2015, nearly 1 year after Mark's death, another high-profile murder shocked the drill scene, this time involving OTF Chino. OTF Chino, whose real name was Uchenna Adjina, was a close affiliate of rapper Lil Durk and served as both his manager and his cousin. On March 27, 2015, Chino was sitting in a parked car in Avalon Park when a gunman walked up and opened fire, hitting him in the head and chest. He was rushed to Advocate Trinity Hospital, but died shortly after. The murder stunned Durk's circle and the wider drill community because Chino was a figure deeply tied into OTF's operations. Within hours of the news breaking, speculation began swirling that 051 YM had been involved, and Melly's name quickly surfaced in those discussions. Street rumors claimed that Chino's murder was payback for Lil Mark's death the year before, making the cycle of retaliation clear to anyone watching. No official charges tied Melly or 051 YM to Chino's killing, but online forums, blogs, and even YouTube documentaries pointed to him as the likely hitter. For many in Chicago, the timing made sense, and people connected the dots in a way that made Melly's reputation grow even more. Being whispered about in connection to the murder of someone as important as OTF Chino pushed his name into another level of fear and respect. In the streets, that kind of reputation brought power, but it also made him a bigger target than ever. The violence did not slow down, and just 2 months later, another killing added to the long list of names tied to the ongoing wars. On May 31st, 2014, OTF Nunu, also known as Nuski, was shot and killed while driving through the South Side. Nuski was a cousin of Lil Durk and an up-and-coming rapper himself, signed under OTF and known for his collaborations. He was killed in his car on 71st and South Cottage Grove, a shooting that carried the signature of gang retaliation. Although his murder technically came before Chino's, the speculation about who was behind it intensified after the 2015 killing of Chino. Some rumors connected Nuski's death to STL and Gyro City affiliates, while others suggested that 051YM had a hand in it. Again, no official evidence tied Melly to Nuski's death, but his name was included in online discussions about potential shooters. The speculation that 051YM had been involved in back-to-back murders of Lil Durk's close affiliates fueled the idea that Melly was directly responsible. People began repeating his name in the same breath as some of the city's most notorious shooters, and the legend of him stacking bodies began to take hold. Every time a major figure in the drill world was killed, his name found its way into the conversations, whether there was proof or not. This constant association created a cycle where Melly's reputation grew larger with each new death, regardless of what could ever be proven. In July 2015, more tragedy struck when OTF Capo, another artist closely tied to Lil Durk, was shot and killed on the South Side. Capo, born Marvin Carr, was gunned down in a drive-by shooting in the Inglewood neighborhood. During the shooter's attempt to flee, they ran over and killed a 1-year-old boy named Dylan Harris, who was sitting in a stroller on the sidewalk with his family. The killing of Capo and the accidental death of the child shocked even Chicago, a city used to violence, because it showed the reckless and devastating impact of street wars. The murder of Capo was eventually tied to 2 men from another set, but rumors still swirled online that 051YM members celebrated the news. Once again, Melly's name appeared in the online chatter, despite no concrete evidence linking him to the case. The repeated association between him and high-profile killings kept fueling the idea that he was racking up a body count unlike anyone else. Around this time, another name became linked with Melly's story, and that was Right Hand from THF 46. THF 46 was a set tied closely to the Black Disciples in O Block, and Right Hand, whose government name was Raheem, was considered an important figure there. Sometime in the mid-2010s, Right Hand was shot and killed, and whispers pointed to Melly as being the one responsible. According to some stories, the motive came from a shooting where THF members had targeted Melly and another 051 member, leaving both of them wounded, but alive. Retaliation was expected, and when Right Hand was killed, Melly's name was once again attached to the story. Even though another man, 051 Rio, was arrested for the murder, people continued to believe that Melly had been the real gunman. In the streets, paperwork meant little compared to word of mouth, and the word on Melly's name was that he had taken out Right Hand. Each of these events added more fuel to the legend that Melly was a deadly hitter, stacking bodies for 051 Young Money. By the late 2010s, his name had become one of the most feared in Chicago's underground. Not because of convictions or police reports, but because of the endless rumors tying him to shootings. Online forums like Chiricology kept track of every unsolved case and every rumor, with Melly's name appearing again and again. YouTube channels made videos painting him as Chicago's deadliest shooter, sometimes crediting him with more than 20 murders. In conversations across the city, people started using his name as a warning, a way to say someone was not to be played with. The legend of 051 Melly having 40 bodies to his name might have started as an exaggeration, but it stuck because people kept repeating it. For every unsolved murder on the South Side, someone eventually suggested Melly's involvement, whether true or not. That cycle made his reputation grow into something mythic, with people outside Chicago repeating the claims as if they were facts. In reality, the official record showed only 1 arrest for a stolen car in 2018, and no homicide convictions at all. But the streets cared little for official records, and in their world, Melly was the Gravedigger, the name behind countless murders. The war of retaliations that tied together the deaths of Lil Mark, Chino, Nuski, Capo, and Right Hand turned Melly into one of the most feared figures in Chicago. Each killing deepened the cycle, each rumor added to his legend, and each unsolved case made his name grow stronger. By the time his own death came in 2019, the streets had already painted him as a figure with 40 bodies on his name, whether the evidence backed it or not. That is how legends are made in Chicago's drill culture, through stories whispered on corners, names repeated in songs, and reputations built on fear and retaliation. By the mid-2010s, the name of Yarmel Williams was no longer just tied to his clique, because his reputation stretched across Chicago and even reached outside the city. People started calling him the Gravedigger, a nickname that carried heavy meaning in the streets. The name came from whispers that he was stacking bodies, digging graves for anyone who crossed 051 Young Money. Others called him the Savage, another title that suggested he had no hesitation when it came to handling business. These nicknames were not given by accident. They were labels that reflected how people felt when his name was mentioned, and in the world of drill, those names became as powerful as proof. The drill scene played a huge role in building his reputation, even though Melly himself never became a rapper. His name still got placed in songs, with drill rappers from both allies and rivals using it for clout or intimidation. Rappers from 051YM, like Lil Mark and Drilla, mentioned him in verses, making his presence part of their identity as a clique. On the other side, rivals dissed him on tracks, mocking his reputation or daring him to respond. Each mention gave more life to the legend, because drill rap doubled as documentation of the streets. When a name hit a track, it became part of the city's memory, spreading the story further with every view online. One example of this came after Lil Mark's death in 2014, when diss tracks from rivals mocked his murder. Melly's name often got tied into those back and forth disses, and his reputation as a feared figure only grew. The cycle of music, disses, and retaliation blurred the line between entertainment and real violence, but in the case of Melly, it meant his name stayed alive, even when he was not the one making music. Drill rappers helped keep his story moving forward, feeding both fear and respect for the Gravedigger. Beyond music, online documentaries and YouTube channels pushed Melly's story into wider audiences. Channels dedicated to Chicago drill culture posted videos with titles like Chicago's Deadliest Shooter and the Many Murders of 051 Melly. These videos repeated the rumors of his alleged body count, sometimes claiming he was responsible for 20 or more murders. The videos mixed fact with speculation, but for viewers outside the city, they became the main source of information. That meant the legend of Melly reached kids in other states and even other countries, who repeated the same claims about his name without ever knowing what was real. The internet took a street rumor and turned it into a global myth, and Melly's reputation became bigger than his actual life. In Chicago's street culture, clout and fear often came from the number of bodies attached to your name, whether real or not. Body counts became a type of currency, with higher numbers bringing more respect and more intimidation. Melly's name became valuable because people believed he had stacked more bodies than most. Even if no paperwork proved it, the fear it created was real. Rivals respected him because they believed he was dangerous, and allies respected him because they believed he was loyal enough to ride for them. In the streets, perception mattered more than truth, and Melly's perception was that of a man who lived up to his nicknames. The lack of police convictions only made the legend stronger, because it gave him an untouchable quality. The official record showed almost nothing against him, except a 2018 arrest for a stolen car, which was a misdemeanor. No homicide charges, no confirmed convictions, nothing that matched the scale of his street reputation. That gap between rumor and reality only added fuel to his legend, because people said he was too smart or too cold to ever get caught. The idea that he had 40 bodies with no convictions became part of the myth, turning him into a figure larger than life in the world of Chicago drill. Social media also played a role in shaping the psychology around Melly's name. In the drill era, Instagram posts, Twitter feeds, and Facebook Lives became stages for taunts and intimidation. Melly was known for going online to mock his rivals, using captions and photos to disrespect the dead or threaten the living. He would post himself in rival neighborhoods, showing that he was not afraid to cross into enemy territory. These posts were more than just entertainment. They were psychological weapons meant to shake his enemies and boost his own image. In the streets, disrespect cut deep, and Melly used social media as a way to make that disrespect loud. The psychology of intimidation worked because rivals could never tell how serious a threat was. When someone like Melly mocked you online, you had to decide if it was just words or if it meant real action was coming. That uncertainty made people nervous, and nervous people made mistakes. Melly understood that power, and his reputation grew stronger every time he posted something that made others wonder if he was coming for them next. Fear spread faster than facts, and Melly used that to his advantage. His reputation as cordial but dangerous tied into this as well. People who met him in person often described him as laid back and approachable. someone who could laugh and joke in conversation. At the same time, those same people said he could flip into something different without warning, becoming aggressive or violent if he felt disrespect. That unpredictability added another layer to his legend because it made him harder to figure out. Rivals could not tell if he was about to smile or about to shoot, and that mystery gave him an edge. The streets respected men who kept people guessing, and Melly built that into his identity. By the late 2010s, the reputation of 051 Melly had grown into something unmatched in the city's drill culture. His nicknames, his rumored body count, the songs and documentaries, the online presence, and the lack of convictions all combined to create a legend. He became a figure people told stories about, whether those stories were true or not, and those stories kept his name alive. In the end, the legend of the Gravedigger was built on perception, repetition, and fear. And that legend made him one of the most unforgettable names in Chicago's violent history. Drill rap became one of the most important tools for Chicago street cliques because it was not only music, but also a weapon. Songs carried threats, disrespected rivals, and even celebrated deaths, making drill more dangerous than regular rap. When someone dropped a diss track in Chicago, it was almost guaranteed that violence would follow. The streets treated those songs like official statements, and crews often moved the same night to back up the disrespect with gunfire. This cycle of music leading to shootings and shootings inspiring more music was the heartbeat of drill culture. Melly did not rap himself, but his name became tied to drill because his clique and his rivals constantly used him as a reference. Every diss aimed at 051 Young Money carried his shadow, and every shout-out from his allies built his reputation bigger. After the murder of Lil Mark in 2014, diss tracks multiplied, with the rivals mocking his death on records. Some of these songs mentioned Melly directly, while others dissed 051YM as a whole. Those lyrics were not just about words, they were direct challenges, and the streets treated them like contracts for retaliation. In drill culture, if you dissed the dead, you disrespected their entire clique, and that kind of move could never go unanswered. Melly's name stayed in the middle of that constant cycle of diss and retaliation because he was considered one of the most active members ready to slide for his people. Songs from rival sets like 600, O Block, and Gyro City used disses to stir the pot, with names being dropped that pushed tension higher. On the flip side, tracks from 051YM members like Drilla kept Melly's name alive as someone who represented their side with force. This back and forth created an environment where even people outside the cliques could follow the conflicts just by listening to the music. Diss tracks worked like coded messages, telling the streets who was responsible for killings and who was next to be targeted. Melly's reputation only grew inside that cycle because even when he was not rapping, he was being spoken about constantly. The influence of YouTube channels made this situation even bigger because drill music and the violence around it became global entertainment. Channels like Rap Catch Up started posting updates about shootings, disses, and street rumors, creating a running commentary on the wars. Trap Lore Ross, a British YouTuber, took it even further, dropping long documentaries about Chicago drill that reached millions of viewers worldwide. These documentaries repeated the same rumors about Melly's alleged body count and placed his name at the center of Chicago's bloodiest wars. For viewers outside the city, these videos became the main way they learned about Melly, and those viewers treated the stories as facts. The internet turned Chicago street legends into global myths, and Melly became one of the most repeated names in that mythology. The problem with these documentaries was that they rarely separated fact from speculation. A rumor about Melly being responsible for a killing might have started as a whisper on the block, but once it appeared in a video with hundreds of thousands of views, it became accepted as truth. The reach of YouTube meant that people in other countries believed Melly was the deadliest hitter in America, even though no court records supported those claims. In that way, the internet amplified the myth, turning Melly into something closer to a character in a movie than a real young man from Washington Park. His reputation became entertainment, but that entertainment had real consequences because it shaped how both allies and enemies viewed him in real life. Online forums played another big role in shaping Melly's legend, especially places like Chiricology on Reddit. Chiricology was a space where drill fans gathered to trade stories, rumors, and breakdowns of street conflicts. Users often treated the forum like an investigative board, trying to piece together connections between murders and cliques. Melly's name appeared constantly in those conversations, often linked to killings without any proof. Threads speculated about his role in the deaths of OTF Chino, Nuski, Capo, and many others, making him a constant subject of debate. Once his name became a shorthand for fear, people added him to almost every unsolved case connected to 051YM. The repetition of his name in these spaces made the legend grow even when nothing new had happened. Each time someone posted his name in a rumor, it added another layer to the myth, and soon he became the automatic suspect for anything violent. That constant association cemented his image as the Gravedigger, someone with a body count so high that people stopped trying to calculate it. The forums blurred the line between research and gossip, but in the process they spread his story to more and more people who believed it completely. As these rumors spread, Melly's name took on a life of its own, becoming shorthand for the most dangerous type of street figure. To outsiders, mentioning Melly meant you were talking about someone untouchable, a shooter who had done more than anyone else. Inside Chicago, saying his name meant fear because people believed he was unpredictable and relentless. This dual meaning made him a symbol of Chicago's drill culture, representing both the fascination outsiders had with the city's violence and the real fear that locals lived with daily. His name carried weight in every conversation, whether spoken in a song, a YouTube video, or an online forum thread. By the late 2010s, Melly's reputation had grown so large that it was difficult to separate fact from fiction. The diss tracks, the YouTube documentaries, and the endless online speculation created a feedback loop where his name was constantly repeated. That repetition made him more feared in real life, because rivals believed the hype and acted accordingly. Friends and enemies alike treated him as someone who had 40 bodies on his record, even though the official system had no convictions to prove it. The myth became reality through repetition, and Melly became one of the clearest examples of how drill rap, social media, and online forums could turn a person into a legend bigger than their actual life. Labor Day weekend in 2019 carried the same energy Chicago always had when the summer reached its last stretch, because parties filled the South Side blocks, and people looked for one last chance to enjoy the warm nights before the weather turned cold. On the evening of September 1st, 2019, one of those parties was happening on the 6100 block of South St. Lawrence Avenue in the Woodlawn neighborhood. Inside that home, dozens of people crowded the rooms, drinking, smoking, and laughing, because that night felt like any other South Side gathering. For most of the people there, it was just another holiday weekend. But for Yarmel Williams, the man everyone called 051 Melly, it would be the last time he ever walked into a party. Witnesses later described the vibe inside as loud and chaotic, with music booming and people moving back and forth between rooms. Melly came to the party despite knowing his name carried danger everywhere he went, because that had become normal for him. The walls were filled with faces from different neighborhoods, some familiar, some less known, but nobody in the room expected the night to turn deadly. At some point during the night, shots rang out inside the house, and the noise of music and voices turned instantly into chaos. People scrambled for cover, pushing through doors and diving for the floor, because gunfire in a crowded house left no safe space. Melly was struck multiple times by the bullets, falling to the floor in the same way he had once been imagined standing over rivals. Alongside him, a woman was hit in the foot, but she managed to survive her injuries. Melly's wounds were different, because those shots carried the weight of someone determined to end his story for good. By the time paramedics arrived, he was barely holding on, and the house that had moments before been filled with laughter was now silent except for screams and cries. He was transported to the hospital, but the wounds were too much, and before long, the Gravedigger of 051 Young Money was pronounced dead. The silence that followed the shooting told its own story, because witnesses refused to speak openly to police. Detectives who responded to the scene found themselves facing the same wall of silence they always ran into when dealing with gang-related shootings in Chicago. People at the party claimed they did not see who fired the shots, even though the house had been crowded and the shooting happened in close range. Some said they were too busy running for cover. Others claimed they had their backs turned. But either way, nobody gave up a name. For police, the lack of cooperation made the investigation nearly impossible, and frustration grew as they realized the case would likely end up unsolved, like so many others on the South Side. On the streets, though, rumors spread almost instantly, and the most repeated one was that Melly had been backdoored. In Chicago slang, being backdoored meant being set up by someone close, someone trusted enough to let you walk into a trap without realizing it. Whispers named Taekwon World, a rival clique from 63rd Street that had long been at odds with 051YM as the group responsible for the setup. Stories claimed that someone inside the party had tipped them off, making sure Melly was caught in a situation where he could not defend himself. The theory of betrayal carried weight because Melly had built his reputation on being cautious, on never letting himself be easily caught. For him to be shot down inside a crowded house suggested to many that someone had lured him into a vulnerable position. These rumors took hold quickly because betrayal was a common story in Chicago's clique wars. Countless names before had fallen to setups, where friends turned to enemies or neutral parties played both sides. Melly's story fit that same pattern, and people believed it because of how sudden and unexpected his death felt. Some even speculated that the betrayal came from someone inside his own circle, though no evidence ever backed that claim. What mattered in the streets was not proof but perception, and the perception was that Melly had been backdoored in a move that shocked both allies and rivals. The immediate aftermath of his death spread across social media, with tributes pouring in from allies and taunts coming from rivals. Members of 051 Young Money posted pictures and captions honoring their fallen brother, calling him a legend and promising that his death would not go unanswered. Posts described him as the heart of their set, someone whose name carried weight far beyond their blocks. On the other side, rivals used his death as fuel for their own narratives, mocking him in the same way drill rappers had mocked so many others before him. Diss posts and comments popped up online within hours, turning the tragedy into another point in the endless cycle of disrespect. In neighborhoods across the South Side, word of his death spread fast, and shock followed. Even in a city used to violence, the killing of someone as feared and respected as Melly stood out. For many, his death proved that no one was untouchable, no matter how heavy their reputation. People who had whispered his name in fear now whispered about how quickly he had been taken down, and that shift showed the fragile nature of street legends. One day you could be the most feared hitter in the city, and the next day you could be lying on a floor with no one willing to say who pulled the trigger. The police meanwhile released little information beyond confirming his death and the injuries to the woman at the party. No arrests were made, no suspects publicly identified, and the case remained open but stagnant. Investigators expressed frustration at the lack of cooperation, but to people in the streets, that silence was expected. Talking to police carried consequences that most were unwilling to risk, especially when the victim was someone like Melly, whose legend was tied to retaliation and violence. The official investigation stalled, but the street version of the story moved fast, shaping how people remembered that night. Retaliation threats appeared almost immediately, with 051YM members posting online that Melly's death would not go unanswered. The idea of revenge was central to their identity, and losing someone like Melly only made that desire stronger. Rivals braced themselves for potential attacks, knowing that a loss of that magnitude could spark violence across multiple neighborhoods. The fear of retaliation became another part of Melly's legacy, because even in death, his name carried weight that made people cautious. Tributes to Melly came in many forms, from social media posts to graffiti tags on walls across the South Side. Some called him the Gravedigger one last time, while others painted him as a fallen soldier in Chicago's endless wars. For his friends and allies, he was remembered as loyal, fearless, and unpredictable, someone who lived by the code of the streets until the very end. For his enemies, his death was another reason to celebrate, another opportunity to mock the reputation that had loomed over them for years. In both cases, his name remained at the center of conversations, proving that his legend did not die when he did. The house on South St. Lawrence, where the shots were fired, became a landmark in those conversations, remembered as the place where one of the city's most feared names fell. People who had been at the party avoided speaking publicly, but the memory of that night lingered in the neighborhood. Each retelling of the story added more detail, more speculation, and more myth, ensuring that the final hours of 051 Melly would remain a subject of debate long after his death. The silence of witnesses, the rumors of betrayal, the frustration of police, and the threats of retaliation all combined to create a final chapter that matched the rest of his life. His story had always been one of whispers, rumors, and legends, and his death followed that same path. In the end, the party on South St. Lawrence was not just another gathering on the South Side. It was the closing scene for a man whose name had defined an era of violence and myth in Chicago. The shots that ended Melly's life carried more than bullets. They carried the weight of years of wars, losses, and reputations built on fear. His death left a void in 051 Young Money, a mark on the city's history, and a legend that people still repeat. For the streets, the story was not about how he died, but about how his name lived on. And in that way, even the final hours of 051 Melly became part of the myth that surrounded him. The killing of Yarmel Williams, better known as 051 Melly, sent immediate shockwaves through Woodlawn and beyond because his name carried so much weight across the city. In the days following his death, the blocks around South St. Lawrence were filled with fear, anger, and confusion. Members of 051 Young Money moved cautiously, posting tributes online, while also sending messages that retaliation would come. The city had seen countless killings over the years, but losing Melly was different because his reputation made him more than just another casualty of the streets. To his clique, his death was personal, but to outsiders, it symbolized the dangerous cycle that kept dragging Chicago deeper into bloodshed. Almost immediately, rumors began to swirl that Taekwon World had been behind the setup, fueling the theory that Melly had been backdoored at the house party. Taekwon World had long been at odds with 051YM, and their rivalry stretched across years of shootings and disses. People online repeated the theory that TW members planned the setup and executed it with precision, making sure Melly had no chance to defend himself. Whether or not the rumor was true, it spread fast because the streets always needed someone to blame. The perception that TW carried responsibility raised the stakes even higher, and the threat of retaliation loomed over every block connected to them. In the weeks after his death, reports of shootings tied to 051YM appeared, with speculation that they were moving in response to losing their most feared member. Gunfire echoed across rival neighborhoods, and the whispers of who might be next traveled quickly. The South Side had always been trapped in cycles of retaliation, but Melly's death threatened to spark something even bigger. Every shooting that followed carried his shadow because people believed 051YM was determined to avenge him. The reality of who was actually pulling triggers mattered less than the perception that his clique would not let his death slide. The ripple effects of Melly's death stretched into later years, connecting to high-profile events that kept Chicago's violence in national headlines. In August 2020, Carlton Weekly, better known as FBG Duck, was shot and killed in broad daylight in the Gold Coast, one of Chicago's wealthiest neighborhoods. The murder shocked the city because of its location, happening in an upscale shopping district far from the usual South Side battlegrounds. Speculation about that shooting connected it to years of ongoing beefs, with ties reaching back to cliques like O-Block and 051YM. While Melly himself was gone by then, his death remained part of the web of violence that shaped how cliques moved and retaliated. His story was another piece of the chain reaction that kept escalating until even figures like FBG Duck became targets. The community reaction to Melly's death and the violence that followed was split between grief and calls for peace. Activists and church leaders in Woodlawn and Washington Park urged young men to break the cycle, using his story as an example of how quickly reputations could end in tragedy. They held rallies and marches, demanding an end to shootings that left entire generations broken. At the same time, on the streets, the appetite for revenge outweighed the calls for peace. For many of Melly's allies, talking about forgiveness was not realistic when the pain of losing him was fresh. Their tributes promised retaliation, and their actions reflected the code that had defined the South Side for decades. Chicago had long been caught between those two responses, with activists calling for healing while cliques pushed the cycle further. Melly's death captured that contradiction perfectly because it was both a chance for reflection and a spark for more violence. His story highlighted the way reputations built on fear could leave behind chaos once those men were gone. For the community, the question was whether young men could learn from that story and step back, or whether the streets would keep repeating the same tragedies. The aftermath of September 2019 made it clear that the cycle was far from over, and Melly's death only added another layer to Chicago's long list of retaliations and escalations. The story of Yarmel Williams, known everywhere as 051 Melly, ended on a Labor Day night in 2019, but his name kept moving through Chicago and far beyond. His legend lived on in graffiti tags, in drill lyrics, in YouTube documentaries, and in the whispers of people who spoke his name with either fear or respect. To many on the South Side, he became the example of how far a reputation could carry you, but also how quickly that same reputation could put you in the grave. His life was shaped by Randolph Towers, by family ties to the streets, by loyalty to 051 Young Money, and by years of war with rivals. Each moment added to the legend, and by the time of his death, his story had already crossed from reality into myth. The nicknames he carried, like the Gravedigger and the Savage, summed up the way people saw him, whether those names were deserved or not. For allies, he was someone loyal, someone willing to ride for his clique without hesitation. For rivals, he was the figure to fear, the man whose name carried the weight of dozens of bodies, even if most of those claims were never proven. In the streets, proof mattered less than perception, and Melly's perception was that of a hitter who could never be underestimated. That is why his name was repeated again and again until it became a symbol of Chicago's drill era. For the wider world, Melly's story became part of the fascination with Chicago drill culture, a culture where music, violence, and reputation blended together into something that spread globally through the internet. Documentaries, songs, and online forums turned him into a character almost larger than life, someone who represented both the danger and the allure of the South Side. His story highlighted how easily a young man from Washington Park could be transformed into a myth that people discussed thousands of miles away. That transformation came at the cost of his life, and it showed how dangerous the mix of clout, music, and street politics could be. In reflection, Melly's legacy is complicated because it is not just about violence or fear, but also about the culture that shaped him and the cycle that continues after him. His story is both a warning and a lesson, showing how the streets of Chicago can raise a legend, but also destroy one just as quickly. Whether people remember him as a feared gravedigger, a loyal friend, or simply another victim of Chicago's endless wars, the truth is that his name became part of the city's history. The legend of 051 Melly is one that still lingers, because in Chicago, names never really die. They just live on in the stories that people keep telling.